today. We had a change of location. Normally we're down in the hall center. It's being used down there this afternoon, so we're holding it here in Watson. And this is our third Digital Humanities seminar of the semester, and we're pleased to have Peter Grund here today from the English department. Peter's research interests are historical English linguistics, early American English, corpus linguistics, electronic editing, and the vernacularization of science. So we'll just get started and turn it over to Peter.
Thank you, and thank you, Marianne and Brian, for inviting me to talk about my ongoing project. Thank you all for coming out to hear about the combination of handwriting, manuscripts, and witches, which is an interesting combination. What I would like to do today is basically report on an ongoing collaborative project that I'm undertaking with two colleagues, Margo and Matti Peikola. And what we're trying to do, in essence, is compile a scribal database of all the recorders from that we know of from the documents of the Salem witch trials. And the scribal database will also include information on handwriting, gradations, spelling, and all kinds of other things that I will show you later on. In terms of the structure of this talk, I will start by giving you a little bit of background to the project, and then I will outline what the current project is actually about. I will focus on Checkley, and Checkley is what we call our electronic database tool, and it's a little bit of a pun baked into that, but I'll come back to that later on. And then I will talk about where we're going in the future and some of the problems that we're facing at the moment as we're taking the next step with the project. And then I will finish with talking about the contributions that we hope that this project will make. So to start with the background, all three of us, Margo, Matti, and I, were involved in compiling the edition of the documents from the Salem witchcraft trials. And there were 12 of us doing that, and it took us about 10 years to do it. But it's finally done, and it came out in 2009. And now we're sort of starting on the next step in the process. The original goal of the edition, I'm going to set this up a little bit, the original goal of the edition that we compiled was basically to correct the earlier edition from 1977 that was produced by Willard and Salem. And they actually did not do any transcribing themselves. They actually took earlier existing transcriptions from the 1930s. Those transcriptions were done by the Works Progress Administration and by people who were not as knowledgeable about colonial handwriting as one might have hoped. And they basically took those transcriptions and put them into a new edition. And over the years, many people have noticed mistakes and strange formulations and missing documents in this edition. So at the earliest stages of the edition, we basically saw it as a correcting project. We thought it would be easy to just go in and correct individual words and add to documents. But it turned out to be much more complicated than that, which is indicated by the fact that it took us 10 years to do it. And we found lots of complicating factors once we got back to the actual manuscripts. And one of them, one of the really big ones, was the scribal context of the documents. And the identity of the reporters would have taken down these 1,000 documents. Previous to this, there had been very few just sporadic comments on who these people would have been. The assumption seems to have been that they were all basically court clerks. So a limited number of court clerks basically took down 1,000 documents within a year. That would have been quite the feat. But once we started looking at the documents, we had quite a few surprises. More than 200 people were involved in taking down the recording documents. And I'll come back to some of the complexities of documents. We're talking about documents later on. Many documents were written by more than one person. We hadn't known that at all, because in the edition it looks like a text that was written by one person. That was absolutely not true. Most documents are actually written by 3 or 4 or even 5 people. So there are various contributions to this document. But perhaps most interesting is the finding that the recorders were, can be named, and they were inhabitants of Salem, Salem town, Salem village, and neighboring towns. They were actually ordinary villagers who were involved in taking down these documents. And that sounds a little bit peculiar in terms of the legal context that we're dealing with. But the legal context was very different from our legal context. I'll come back to that. And just to give you an idea of what these documents might look like, this is Mary Warren's testimony. It was written, we know who all of the recorders were, and there are 3 recorders here. The first recorder, who starts from the very beginning and writes up until here, was Edward Putnam, who was the deacon at Salem Village at the time. His brother, Thomas Putnam, takes over here and writes until here. And Thomas Putnam was obviously not completely happy with the original recording, because he added things to Edward's writing. So you can see at the very top, it says aged 20 years. At the very, very top, there's an addition. And there's actually an addition at the corner, the right-hand corner over there, where it says John Proctor, and he added Junior, just to make sure that we know that it's John Proctor Jr., not Senior. And then at the end, we have another annotation, and this is actually by a court clerk who worked for the jury of inquest. And the jury of inquest would determine whether someone was going to be sent to trial or not. So when Mary Warren came in to swear to her testimony, and she did swear to her testimony, a scribe would, or a recorder would add this annotation saying that she did that on this particular day. And this reporter is Andrew Elliott, who was from the neighboring village of Beverly. He had worked as a town clerk in Beverly for a very long time. So obviously he was recruited to do this, to work for the jury inquest. And this is what a lot of documents look like. Various additions, corrections by other people. So they're quite complex in terms of different scribal contributions. Now, within the editorial project, we realized pretty quickly that this is quite significant to find out who these people were. But within the editorial project, we couldn't do as much as we wanted because there was a limited amount of time, a limited amount of resources. But the 3 of us were working on these scribes within the editorial project. But we had to stop at one point and say, okay, these are the people that we're very confident that we know the name of at this point, and there were about 20. So we said, we're going to name these in the edition, and then we'll leave the rest for future research, which is a significant number of people. But what we did do was that in the transcriptions, we noted all changes of handwriting. So if you look at the edition, you'll see that every document starts with an annotation saying hand 1. And if there's a change, it goes as hand 2, and maybe there's maybe hand 1 comes back, or there's a hand 3 or hand 4. So we made all of those annotations, but we did not take the step of identifying who all these people were, except for so when we had finished the edition, we said, okay, we need some time away from the Salem documents, and we didn't pursue this project immediately. But then something happened. The Hall Center announced collaborative, they wanted applications for a collaborative research seed grant. So we thought this is a good opportunity to get think about what we actually want to do in terms of larger applications in this project. So we put together an application, and we were very fortunate to give it a seed grant, which has enabled us to do great many things, and I'll come back to some of the things that we've done with that seed grant a little bit later. But within this new project, we have a number of goals, and the main goal is, as I said, to compile this scribal database. And this is what I will talk mostly about today, the scribal database. But we also want to make available the scribal database as a tool so that it can be used in other contexts. So anyone working on scribes or handwriting or abbreviations or spelling or whatever can use the database shell and import their own data into this database tool. So it will be made publicly available for free. Finally, and this is a long-term project, but we're interested in literacy and scribal culture in colonial America. What does the Salem episode tell us about who could write, what it meant to be able to write, and how writing was actually a part of the economy of these villages, because you would actually go and you would pay someone to have something written for you. So who would these people have been, and how was it part of sort of networks within these Salem communities? This is something that I won't say very much about today, because I don't know very much about it quite yet, because we're not done with this project. So what I want to focus on today is Checkley. Checkley is, as I said, the database tool that we're working on constructing and preparing at the moment. There's a lot, it's very preliminary, and we're still tweaking it. And as I said, it is a little bit of a pun. It has to do with checking, of course. There's a lot of checking when it comes to handwriting and spelling and such things. But we're very fortunate to have a man named Checkley in our material. And he was the Attorney General for the province of Massachusetts, and he prosecuted most of the cases during witchcraft trials. And it is his handwriting that you see in the background. And we find a lot of samples of his handwriting in the indictment documents that would outline the charges against alleged witches. So he is responsible for writing these documents. And so Checkley is basically a tool for storing, managing, and charting handwriting and recorded information. And we hope to add quite a few search features to this tool, but that is not happening quite yet. And you will see what we hope to do in the future. It's an open source tool, which means that the code will be available to anyone. And the access to the finished product, both the Salem Scribal database and the shell, will be free of charge once we're done. So let me show you what it looks like, and I hope this will work well. So this is basically just the first page of the project, basically, that we're using to publicize that we're working on the project. So far, the actual Scribal database is not available to the public because it's not done, and we don't want to publicize the material that is not done yet. But I will give you a peek at what it might look like. Bear with me. Is this too small? Can you see this? It's okay. So the interface is still under construction, and we're sort of trying out different possibilities. So we don't know if this is what it will look like take a little bit of time to go over. And what you can see is basically it's a listing of the recorders that we have identified by name, and further down we get a whole list of unidentified recorders, and I will say more about those later on. So you see the name, a sample of their handwriting, and how many documents we've identified with this particular handwriting in it. So some of the recorders only appear in one document. That's actually quite common. I'll try not to make you seasick by going up and down too much. You can click the individual names to get more information on the different recorders. And here I've chosen Samuel Parris, who was the minister of Salem at the time. And what you get is, again, an image of the handwriting, a description, and this is very much under construction, but you get a description of his activities, his handwriting, and sometimes the spelling if there's something idiosyncratic or peculiar about the handwriting. And then you get a listing of the manuscripts where he has contributed something. You get the number of the hand, so he's hand number 3 in a particular document. Amount is a very blunt tool at the moment, where you're just usually using hash marks to indicate basically how much of a contribution there is. And we will have exact number of words at a later point, but we're not there quite yet. Let's see. There's one I wanted to show you. You can go in and have a look at individual documents, and what you get to see is basically what are the different recorders that have been identified in this particular document. So Samuel Parris is hand 1, but then you have contributions by other people as well. And you can also have a look at the actual document. This is a small version of it, and then a larger one. And he wrote very neat documents, and he was mostly involved in writing cross-examination documents. So when an alleged witch would have been cross-examined, he would have been there to write down what they said. And this is obviously a very polished version. We actually know that he was proficient in shorthand. So he wrote everything in shorthand, would go away, and then he would put together these documents, which adds a number of interesting complications to understanding what these documents were. Tell me if I'm going too quickly, if you want to have a look at it.
Somewhere you must be able to identify the individual to the hand. I mean, do they actually have their signature
Yes.
at some places so
Yes.
that you can do this?
Yes, yeah, and that's something I will come back to a little bit later, how we go about determining that this is actually the person. But yes, it has to do with signatures and actually going outside the Salem documents to look at other types of writings. So yes, you're absolutely right. I'll show you one more example. So it's loading at the same time as I'm trying to fix it.
Here, is it searchable?
I'll come back to that in a second, but it's a good question. So this is just another example to show the structure of of the entries. So this is Thomas Putnam, and some of you might know Thomas Putnam because he sort of features prominently in Crucible and other contexts. And he was writing a lot at this point. Actually, he has about, he contributes to 140 Mark II manuscripts. And interestingly enough, he writes depositions for many of the core group of accusers, so young women and girls that basically constituted the core group of accusers during the trials. He basically writes all of those depositions. And he was the father of one of these little girls. And that opens up all kinds of interesting questions, of course, about whose testimony are we actually looking at? Did he influence the way these testimonies look? And he is interesting for many reasons because his spelling is quite idiosyncratic. So as soon as you see which spelled W-I-C-T-H, you know, okay, this is Thomas Putnam. No one else does that. So it's very idiosyncratic.
But how standardized is the spelling across recorders?
Not very. You see quite a lot of regular spelling among the court clerks. But if you look at the ordinary villagers, there's actually very little standardization because there was no clear standard at this point, although one was slowly developing. But yes, there is quite a lot of variation among documents because many of the reporters would have spelled the way they pronounce something, so there are a lot of phonetic spellings.
I mean, my understanding is sort of pre-Noah Webster, it was basically up for grabs.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely true. But you do see that some of the court clerks that come in from Boston have a very regular spelling that you don't find in the documents written by
So there is some standards somewhere.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's definitely underway, but it's not a clear standard that everyone is adhering to.
Conceivably, the Boston clerks received the educations from similar or identical teachers.
Yeah,
Mm.
that's quite possible, quite likely.
But not only is there no standardization of spelling, but it looks to me from examples that the handwriting or the paleography isn't very standardized either. And that's different from the later medieval and even 16th century stuff that I know.
Well, there were basically two competing handwriting systems at this time. There was the old secretary handwriting, and then there was the italic handwriting. And what people did was that they mixed these two in an interesting jumble. So we see a lot of hybrid scripts and a lot of experimenting with scripts. So that's why you see quite a lot of variation in terms of what the handwritings look like. But that's one of the issues that we're interested in. When does this transition take place? Because there is a transition into the kind of handwriting that's very similar to the handwriting that we have now, which is called a round hand. And that is taking place around this time. And you do see some of the recorders using that type of handwriting. Now, Susan asked me a very good question. It has to do with searches. What can you actually search? And we have experimented with two things so far, but there will be more search options in the future. So one of the things that we want to add is searching by town. So I mentioned that there are actually a number of towns involved: Salem town, Salem village, Andover, Beverly, Ipswich, and people are coming from various places. It's actually very interesting to see where the reporters were working, because they seem to be working in different communities and taking down documents for people from that particular community. We also want to have a search thing for document type. Document type is forms. So say that you have a document and you're interested in seeing, can I match this with a document already in the database for a particular writer? Or if you're interested in interpreting what is this particular letter form, was it used widely in the period? And this again is not completely exhaustive, but what we hope to do is basically have a charting of various kinds of letter forms that people are using, so that you can go in, have a look at the letter form and connect it with a particular recorder or a particular document. So here you see various kinds of capital E's, for instance. Obviously this is not finished, but this is what you can see, and then you can go back and have a look at these particular letter forms in context later on when the search feature is done. Another feature that we hope to have in the future is basically a combination type search, where if you see that a particular recorder has 3 types of E, and that's not actually uncommon, some people do, you can click all those 3 types of E and search for all recorders that have those 3 types of E. You get a list of them to see who was using this particular type of combination handwriting at the time. And you can do whatever kinds of combination searches that you want to do. So this is not a full listing. This is a working tool at the moment. And there are certain letter forms that are more diagnostic and more interesting in terms of separating handwriting or identifying handwriting from others. So E tends to be very diagnostic. R is also very diagnostic. P as well, and ampersand. The ampersand has some weird and wonderful forms in its period. A lot of them. So we're hoping to add quite a few search features for not only search features that would be of interest to the Salem charting, but also features that would be of interest to people who are doing other scribal projects, because we're also looking to, as I said, looking to publish it or make it available as a shell. I'm going to go back, and I can come back to the scribal database afterwards when we have the question answered, if you're interested in some of the other features here. So this is where we're at the moment, and now it's sort of moving forward. Where do we go from here? So far, we have identified about 110 different people's handwriting. Some more confidently than others, and it has to do with, have we found a signature that matches the handwriting? Have we found corroboration from other manuscripts, and so on. But that leaves us with about 150 unidentified recorders, or 150 unidentified handwriters. And who were they, and how would we ever find out who these people were? Because we're pretty much exhausted the Salem materials, or the internal evidence for who these people might have been. Well, there are some patterns that might help us in target who these people might have been. And one of them is that most of these handwritings are found in witness depositions. This is actually quite significant because it ties in with what we know about legal procedure at the time. In 1650, there was a Massachusetts Bay Colony law that had a huge impact on the legal system. And I'll read this out and I'll explain it afterwards, because it's quite interesting. Whereas experience doth show the inconvenience of taking verbal testimonies in court by reason of many impertinencies in their relations, so that the clerk cannot well make a perfect record of, and to prevent all mistakes and ungrounded jealousies against the officers, be it hereby enacted and decreed that henceforth all testimonies shall be presented in writing to the court, either attested before a magistrate, or, if the party be within 10 miles of the court, to be then attested in court upon oath. Now this actually means that anyone could write a witness deposition. It did not have to be a court clerk at all. And this is indeed what seems to have happened, that people would write their own testimonies and witness depositions. They would take it to the court or to a magistrate and say, this is my witness statement. They would take it, and if they accepted it or admitted it into evidence, the person would be called to court to swear to the testimony after it had been read out aloud. So they would read out the written version, and the person would be asked to swear to this statement. So this is quite significant in terms of how these documents came about. And out of about 1,000 documents, there are 400 witness depositions. So it's a substantial number of documents. So we have two working assumptions. So these are quite straightforward or self-evident working assumptions in terms of working with this material. One, some of these depositions are self-authored. People would write them themselves and submit them to court. And we have evidence for that from the identified reporters, the named reporters. So I'll show you an example of that. So this is Simon Willard's testimony against George Burroughs, who was the former minister of Salem. We know Simon Willard very well. He was a merchant. He also worked for the court as a court clerk for the jury of inquest, very much like Andrew Elliott that we saw previously. And he basically wrote his own testimony. He signed it. It was admitted into evidence, which you see by this formulation here, which was written by the court clerk Stephen Sewell, and it says "jurat in curia," which basically means swears in court. So it's attested that he swore to it in court. So he basically wrote his own witness testimony, witness statements. And we're quite sure, of course, that this happened in other cases as well. Now, the second assumption then, it's also fairly self-evident, that in some cases there was someone else writing for another person. We know that quite a few people in Salem and the neighboring communities did not know how to write. We see that by the fact that we have, instead of signatures, we have marks on quite a lot of documents. So they obviously did not know how to write. Or they might not know how to write a deposition. They might not be sure of the genre conventions for a deposition. So they would go to someone else who knew how to write. And this might, of course, be a friend. It might be a relative. The New Englanders were very litigious. They were involved in lots of lawsuits, 2 or 3 at a time, most often. And it would sort of be about borders for their land. It would be about pigs and cattle and so on and so forth. But very often, these people were probably people who had to know how to write because of their profession somehow. So town clerks, parish clerks, medical doctors, ministers, merchants, etc. So the question is, how do we get at these people? How can we ever find out? Just a couple of weeks ago, the three of us met in Boston. We spent 2 weeks in Boston. That was absolutely wonderful. We visited about 12 different archives to look at contemporaneous documents. Because our idea was that if they were writing within the Salem, within the context of the Salem trials, they would also be writing in other contexts. We were not very confident that we would find a lot of material, because if you look at catalogs, if you look at what previous scholars have said about how much material is available from this period, it doesn't seem to be much. But in fact, it is a lot. It is just that there isn't a lot of literary material from this period, but there are a lot of letters, a lot of legal documents, deeds, witness depositions, account books, more utilitarian texts, written by people from Salem and the neighboring towns. They would have their own account books, they would write letters, they would sign deeds, they would write deeds, they would write depositions in other contexts. So this is the material that we wanted to access. And our goal was to basically do a survey, what is available. But while doing that survey, we found so much that it is quite incredible. We made many, many discoveries of who these people were already just during the survey. So I can just imagine what we will find once we launch a more systematic search of who these people were. And I'll tell you about 2 cases. One was an account book. We found an account book by a medical doctor from Salem. I forget his first name, Joshua Barton, who had written down exactly all the transactions that he did ever. And in this account book, he says things about people he taught how to write and how much he charged. Boys as well as girls, which is actually quite interesting. He also says how much he charged to write a witness deposition, which is very, very interesting, of course, because that tells us that these people were involved in writing.
So could you see the dates that he entered into his account book and line them up with the dates of depositions?
Well, unfortunately, his account book only stretches until 1670. So we don't have access beyond that. But we know he does say that I taught Thomas Putnam Sr.'s son how to write. So either Edward Putnam or Thomas Putnam. So he was the person who taught either of them how to write. But I wish there are more account books, so we're looking at these account books, and that might actually show some things. Yes?
I don't think I understand when you say who were they? Is that you don't have a name, or you do have their name, and you're looking for what their life was like? When you say who were these people, the 150 unidentified recorders, are those people that you just have a unique handwriting and
Yes.
no name attached?
Yes.
Okay, got it.
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I sort of clarified that. Yeah, that's absolutely right. We just have the handwriting, and we just can't connect it with a particular person or name.
Okay.
An interesting case is the case of Thomas Chandler, who was a selectman in Andover. And a selectman is basically a member of the governing or the executive council in a particular town. They were in charge of the finances and basically running the town. And Andover was, I think it's northwest of Salem Village. And they were drawn into these trials quite late in the process. Now, before we went to Boston, and this has not been updated yet. We found a particular handwriting in 4 documents, and we had no idea who this person was. We knew that the handwriting was the same in the 4 documents. And we called it unidentified Scribe Foster. I mean, that's just a label. It doesn't mean anything. And we thought that maybe it is Andrew Foster because he is one of the witnesses. We were going on the assumption that maybe this person wrote his own witness deposition, or at least that was an early assumption, but then we found these other witness depositions as well, so it made it a little bit more complicated because it could technically be Joseph Hutchinson, or it could be Thomas Chandler, or it could be someone completely different. We just couldn't tell within the context of the Salem documents who this was. So we had no idea. But what happened was that and what you have on top is a pretty bad image of the witness testimony by Thomas Chandler that he submitted to the court in Salem. So this is a Salem document. On the bottom, you see what is called, it's an extract from the selectman's book. So the selectman would actually keep a record of what they were doing in a particular town. So we went to the Andover Historical Society to look at what this book was like and what kind of handwriting was in there. And we found this. And I won't bore you with all the details of how we went about identifying that this is the exact person, but I'll just show you a couple of things. Now, this is a signature, so it's Thomas Chandler's signature. He signs, he says, selectman in the name of the rest. So he signed for all these selectmen. And you can see that the signature matches the handwriting, the name in the actual testimony, although there it's not a signature. He has some very characteristic letter forms. This is his W. And you do see similar W's elsewhere, but in combination with other features, this is quite telling. The word "and" is exactly the same, and what is particularly interesting is this formation of the D. You can see the sort of sweeping loop that sort of covers the whole word, basically. If you look at other Ds, you can see that it's a characteristic feature of his handwriting. And his combination RE, and there are many other examples in the larger extract that we have, is also quite distinctive in terms of setting him apart from other types of handwriting. So here we had a match. Now we knew who this person is for sure. And this information we would never have been able to figure out on the basis of the Salem documents alone. Now, not all cases are as straightforward as these. So what we will end up doing in the end is we will probably work with a type of confidence system that we identify this with this level of confidence or that level of confidence. And it all depends on whether we have access to a signature, how many additional documents we have access to in contextualizing what we find in the Salem material. Because there are all kinds of complicated matters involved in using supporting material, and I can talk more about that if you're interested. So, come to the end of the talk, just to talk a little bit about what we hope that this will contribute. Well, the first thing is, of course, Checkley in 2 ways. So we're hoping that the scribal database, with all its information from the Salem material, will be of interest to many different kinds of scholars. Not only Salem scholars, but people who are interested in handwriting, spelling, linguistics, and also genealogists. There are a lot of people who are interested in tracing family roots. And here is quite a lot of information on people living in the community
Are you going to, register your ownership? Because this could be very lucrative for the market.
Well, we were actually thinking about making it available for free. That's our aim at the moment. So, we were not thinking about the lucrative aspects.
You may still have to protect that freedom.
Say that again?
You may still have to protect the copyright,
Right.
so that
That's
person
well, that's
doesn't
true.
take it, stamp it something else and
Right.
sell it.
Right. Well, that's absolutely true. That is true.
Would not the unit, whose intellectual property is it?
Well, I guess that's a good question. We have not looked into that, but that's a very good question, I guess.
Because I could see the university saying, if you're not going to make money off this, we are.
And I guess I haven't thought about that at all. Probably something I should be thinking about, or we should be thinking about. We still haven't, we still don't know exactly where this will be hosted. So that's an additional problem or thing to think about. That might impact.
Yeah, I just know it's a huge market out there of people who are doing genealogical searches.
That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. And we're using some of those sources too, so ancestry.com, familysearch.com, as you probably know, the Mormons have microfilm a lot of this material, and they have some really great search engines for accessing we think that this will contribute significantly to people interested in Salem and the larger context of the trials, because now we are able to name people that we know were involved in the trials that no one has known before were actually involved in the trials, and much more actively so than has been suspected. So there's been discussion for many, many years about Thomas Putnam's involvement in the trials, but people have not known that he actually wrote about 120 of the witness depositions. But that is something new that's coming out of the discussion. And then the final thing, which is again very fuzzy because we haven't thought about it in great detail yet, but we are very much interested in the development of handwriting, writing practices and literacy in general, and what this scribal culture meant for the economy of the community. But again, this is very fuzzy, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to talk a lot about that at this point. I think that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm not entirely clear exactly what the database is. It isn't actually the documents themselves, is it?
Well,
you don't, you're not transcribing the actual
No.
document.
No. And that's why it's more of a database than an electronic edition or something like that. But when it's done, the database is much more than just a collection of images, because it does have all the information on handwriting, all the information on spelling, and you will have all the search features which will enable you to bring all of this together to see who was using this type of E at this particular point. Were they of a certain age? Did they have a particular profession? Were they writing a particular document? So that is the database.
That actually brings me to a second question, maybe a more important one. Is there at this time any standard, what should we say, account of 17th century handwriting off of which you can go? Or are you, in effect, having to create one?
No, there's actually quite a lot in terms of general guides, general descriptions of handwriting of this period. But they tend to be very general, but they do provide a descriptive framework. There's much more discussion about handwriting in England, and a lot of that research can be used for colonial America as well. So we're not reinventing or inventing a whole system of handwriting description. Rather, we're using previous models, but we're also providing a more detailed description than many of these general guides.
I remember, because I'm imaging some book on my shelf called Handwriting in America. Who is that by? That's not a quiz. I thought
Right, no,
maybe
no.
you would know right
Well,
away.
there are a couple of them. One is by Thornton, I think, and there's also one by Letitia Yandel. I don't know if that,
Yes, doesn't matter.
yeah. But there are quite a few of those that will help us contextualize what we're doing. But we'll also modify what these guides are saying, because in many respects they have not taken into consideration the type of material that we're looking at, because they're often based on literary material or on letters, whereas this is a different type of material.
I'm curious, this is sort of fascinating in and of itself, but I'm curious to know, in this process, are there instances of particular sort of interpretive avenues that have been opened up because of the research that you've developed here, sort of beyond, identifying, knowing that someone was involved with this? Has that then recognizing who participants are, have any of you worked in your sort of other research aside from this project, outside the context of the project, to develop sort of interpretations of what that knowledge enables?
We haven't, because we've been focusing on these things, but we can see some of the potential coming out of it. I have been working on some other thing. I've been looking at how the witnesses in the witness depositions, how they frame their evidence linguistically. And there, knowing who the recorder was is actually quite important, because the pattern is according to the recorder, not according to the witness or the deponent. So some of those things, but we haven't really explored it fully, but we see the potential.
Will you be applying it for any age limit?
Yes, that's the next step. So that's what we've been working on in within the context of this seed grant. So we've been working on that, and we went to Boston to do some of the preparatory research in order to sort of make it a more solid application. But yes, that's the next step.
Good, good. You mentioned that at this time they're in court a lot. On the other hand, we've got these 200 people involved and so forth. Do you get the sense that these trials were more disruptive to the local culture than we previously thought, or actually less disruptive if they were doing this sort of stuff all the time, and today it just happens to not be about cows?
Right, right. What we've found out is that what people have said is that the witch trials are idiosyncratic or peculiar, and they didn't really follow court procedure and so on and so forth. But in fact, as far as we've found, they actually follow court procedure fairly closely. And it was quite common that a lot of people would have been involved in filing witness depositions and writing all of these different documents. It's just that it was much more condensed to a short period of time, because the witch trials took place basically over a year, and then they were done. Otherwise, you would have trials that would go on forever and ever and ever, and it's just not as condensed. So something that we're finding is that these trials are not as peculiar as people have said before. It's just that we focus so much on these trials, not looking at the larger context.
Yeah, I would think that once you could correlate individual scribes, I'll call them scribes, with particular witnesses and with particular locations and outcomes, I mean, then you really might have something of significance to reinterpret.
Right.
Absolutely. A technical question, did any or all perhaps of these scribes use abbreviations?
Oh yes, a lot of them do, not all of them. And the interesting thing is that our initial assumption was that the court clerks would use more abbreviations than the ordinary villagers would. But that's absolutely not true at all.
And were the abbreviations fairly standard, or?
There are some very standardized things that you find across the whole corpus of writing, but then there are some very idiosyncratic, or I should say that there were flexible strategies of abbreviation. So they were using a system, and within that system you could do whatever you wanted, basically. So superscription, for instance, is a very common strategy. So basically, you would write, if you wanted to write warrant, you would write a W, and then you would superscript a T at the end, and that meant warrant. Or if you wrote communion, you could write CMN and draw a line on top. That meant communion. So basically just indicating that you're leaving out a number of letters. Just draw a line.
So just another technical question about that. Are you capturing those abbreviations, or like the D that you showed us? Are you capturing that in the database?
Yes.
As well? So how is that just like a description, or how do you?
Yes, that will be a description, and it will probably not be individual cases. It will probably be this recorder uses this strategy, and not sort of more detailed than that, unless it is very common and we want to exemplify it. But I'm not sure how much detail it will go into, but we might say uses superscription or does not use superscription.
So if you came across something that, a news source that had a D like that, would there be a way to search for other documents that have?
Yes, so that will actually be part, now it just says letter
Okay.
forms, but it's actually supposed to be part of this, so abbreviations will be here. But then the question is, of course, we can't include everything, so it will be a set number of
So you have some kind of conventions for
Right.
specific
yes,
abbreviations?
yes, but it just hasn't made it into it. So it's very much a tool that's under construction. So that's why we're sort of looking for an NEH grant to actually be able to do some of this stuff.
Are there other pieces that you, when you first were thinking about this database, that you envisioned that would be fantastic to have, and then you had to kind of let go when you started the reality of building the show?
I don't think we're there yet. I think we might have some of those ideas, and it might not be possible to do it because it's just too much, and we won't be able to do it within the context of this database. One thing that I would like to have, for instance, is the age of a recorder. But that will require a lot of biographical research in order to find out when was this person born.
You
You know.
can check the church records.
Yeah, you could do that,
Baptismal.
but not all villages have that, or the documents are not extant, or it might be difficult to tell between junior and senior, or there were several people with the same name living in the community and so on.
It's true, they did name their children after earlier children who had died.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
I have the ultimate naive question. How did you do this? I mean, you've explained what this does, but
Yes.
technically, how did you know how to do this?
Well, It's a very long process. I mean, there's actually quite a lot of work behind this, obviously. We actually started out working with an Excel database. Basically, we went through each document and said, this is hand 1, this is hand 2. And then it was a lot of sorting and figuring out, is this the same hand as this hand? And we started out with a system where we basically printed out every document and started comparing.
How many documents?
Well, it's about 1,000. And some of them are easier than others, and you can say, okay, this is this person, put it aside. And I should say that this database probably has duplicates still, that the same hand has been classified as 2 different hands because 2 different people have been working on this particular scribe. So this is, again, not a completed tool at all, but there was a lot of painstaking comparison, looking at individual letter forms, looking at combination of letter forms. Who could this be?
I didn't mean the scholarship of it.
Oh, okay.
That's why I said this is the ultimate naive question. I meant the technology of it. So is that like just a glorified Excel?
No,
sheet?
no. I am not the right person to answer some of the technical details. Margo Burns is the technical wizard behind all this, but it's not at all Excel. I mean, and she's working with some, actually some very fancy programming, and she's a very good programmer.
Do you know, I mean, is she working with sort of template programs like Excel, or is she having to create her own?
Yeah, I think she's creating her own with the help of a particular code that she's working on. So yes, all the information was imported from Excel, but it's not at all Excel-based.
It seems that the project is going to be very extensive, right? So I have two questions.
Go for it.
The first question is, I understand the testimonies are more or less a summary of what the courtier writes, right? Or the transcriber writes? Or do they actually write what the person said?
Yes, well, allegedly.
Right.
Allegedly. But it's written, it's often written in first person. So I,
okay.
Thomas Chandler, saw this, this, and this, and this person said this to me. So that's what you find very often. So if the person wrote it down himself or possibly herself, then it might be an accurate reflection of what actually, what the person said.
Right.
But if someone else is writing it down, well,
That's right.
how certain can we be?
Right.
That's one of the complications of this material, yes. Did you have a follow-up question?
I did. So on the portions of the documents that are not depositions and are actually transcriptions from the court, like the first document you showed us that had 3 hands, it seemed to be a third-person narrative and not a first-person narrative, right?
Yes, that's true.
That's true.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen? Is there going to be a way to differentiate what the person on the stand actually said from the summary?
Not in this database.
Okay.
And then
Is that
I
even
should-
possible? Is the question.
Well, I mean, in the actual edition, you can see that that's separated because it's hand 1, hand 2, and then you have hand 3, so you can see that someone else actually wrote that. But for the purposes of this recorder database, the scribal database, it's not that important because we're simply interested in who wrote it rather than who the actual witness
Right.
was.
Then the narrative event.
Right.
I was wondering, was it going to show some type of thinking in terms of cultural linguistics? Would it indicate anything like class or where they migrated from? Did they all come together? You know, generations, like you were asking in terms of age.
You mean, will the database show?
Right. You
Well,
said you're getting rid of that stuff, but
No, well, we're not, but I'm
Oh.
thinking that we might have to because the information is so difficult to get at. We have to do a lot of historical, biographical research to find that information, and I'm not sure we'll be able to do it. I mean, it's possible, but
and there won't be any linguistic markers. That's what I'm asking. Like, No, there wouldn't be any of them in there?
What it could be.
No, I mean, there will be handwriting, there will be abbreviations and spelling, but
Mhm.
not really linguistic feature. I mean, that's for
Oh,
other
sorry.
people to
Sorry.
sort of do something
Mhm.
with the material that we're providing.
Okay.
Maybe one way to get that biographical data is to just have hyperlinks inside to some of those other online free databases. So if you can hyperlink to the probate, that same search term into the into an online searchable probate or to land
It's
conveyances or
possible,
something like that.
But it's again the problem when what you do if there are 4 people with the same name living in the community.
But then the searcher just sorts that out, like you're just getting that very
Sure,
handy
well,
hyperlink
sure.
into
And then
the,
leave it
to
up
the name.
to the researcher.
Yeah, but if
Mhm.
you got a field for it, it's
Yeah.
possible that the cloud could fill in the field,
Yeah.
Yeah.
including the converts.
Yeah. Well, that's possible.
Were you ever tempted to go to extraordinary means to make the illegible, legible, viewing things under strange light, or even just reversing the way say a microfilm is reversed?
In
Or
terms of,
did you lose much text to illegibility?
not a lot. There's some, but we had all the documents digitized, so we could manipulate them in various programs to see what was actually there. But there are short stretches, especially canceled out stretches that we just can't see what it is. Or there might be, ink was very acid at this time, so it sometimes eats through the paper. And then there's just a big hole in the paper, and obviously we can't do anything with that. And there are a couple of documents that are extremely faint, but we have used ultraviolet light for that to sort of try to see what's there. But even with that, it's sometimes difficult. But with very few documents, actually, they're in surprisingly good shape.
Well, we love the old paper.
Patrick's
hands
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, that's all right, I was just, yeah.
Go for it.
So it seems, you said you've been at this for 10 years, right?
The edition, yes.
The edition, okay. But even in this linked database, there is encoded through the attributions, both a massive amount of domain knowledge of, who these people are and what that might represent, but also kind of paleographics expertise in having identified these people. And so it's a massive thing just on its own as a database, but because that information is encoded in a relational way, it seems to me to be an ideal training corpus for some kind of automation of this sort of process of identification of hands by visual features, right? So is that something that's been discussed at all? Because, you've been at this for a long time and you're just looking at the court documents, but there are all these possibly linked documents that you've come across, which I think this approach might lend itself to making an algorithm, basically a probabilistic handwriting matching. So
We have not thought about that. We've not thought in those terms at all, actually. But that does bring a different aspect, a different perspective
it's
on it. And then
you can leverage what you've encoded here
Right.
big time, I think.
Right.
So,
I'll take that idea away with me.
yeah.
Let's see if we want to extend the project with a number of
That's right.
other years.
A number of grants follow up.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, right.
There are, in fact, I believe, several serious projects to try to train machines how to read medieval manuscripts.
Yes.
And I don't know much about the detail of this, but I know that this is an ongoing process. And the last time I heard somebody talk about this, they said that they, at least for some manuscripts, have now got it down to that it can read it about 95% accurately.
Wow.
And essentially it's a process of inputting and then correcting and then inputting the next manuscript and teaching the machine how to read it.
Yeah.
But the question you asked about, what do you want to call it, the veracity of the testimony, this is the sort of the hidden person in the room for all medieval documents and all legal documents, probably up till the end of the 19th century, when you may get more accurate court clerks.
Okay.
actually taking down testimony as it's given. Because otherwise, you're quite right. You don't really know always that this is exactly what the person said if it hasn't been normalized in some way. I think historians have often tended to ignore that and just go ahead as if this is really the authentic testimony. When it may be, but it may not be exactly what the person said.
And in fact, it's interesting with the Salem documents because for some cross-examinations we have 2 or 3 different versions of the documents. And when you start comparing those versions, which I've done, there are major differences. And then the question is, well, which one do we rely on? Is one more correct than the other, or they're both completely corrupt? But,
Major differences in what way? I mean, substantive, and then one will say, and then he said X, and the other one leaves that out?
yes, I mean, whole stretches. So there are 2 versions of, I think it's Susanna Martin's cross-examination. And one is about 700 words, and the other one is 1,700 words. So there are really substantial differences. And also when when there's an overlap in the text, there are also major differences in terms of how the questions were formulated, how the answers were given, the level of detail, so on and so forth. So, there are huge implications there, of course. And I was going to say too, though, that modern forensic linguists would say that even witness depositions or deposing nowadays is hugely problematic unless you are video recording it. Because if you're just writing it down, well, there's a lot we do with tone, there's a lot we do with gestures, and that is not captured in a transcription unless there's meta text saying the person laughed or the person flailed. Or
I guess that's what I was looking for, meta text. Because it seemed the first document you showed us might contain some meta text. I didn't read it in detail, but...
The depositions rarely do, but the cross-examination documents do. And you would get the recorder saying, she laughed hysterically, something like that. So they're sometimes very evaluative comments in these documents, which show that these court recorders were not at all objective. I mean, they were people with a vested interest in the trial. So Samuel Parris was the minister, was a staunch believer in the witch trials, and he was quite embattled at this point, and he wanted to show that he could act forcefully during these trials. So.
Do you know if anybody's done this sort of work with any of the other famous trials? I'm thinking 2 trials that have always fascinated me and that I've always wanted to sort of compare is the Anne Hutchinson trial and the Joan of Arc trial.
I don't know that if research has been done.
I can tell you it has been done for somewhat for Joan of Arc, and we have exactly the same problems of if not conflicting testimony, different transcriptions. I think you know in general what happened, but in detail, not quite so certain, because clerks who record these things normalize a conversation, normalize patterns of speech. It's very common.
Yeah, I mean, you also have to look at it from the perspective of the recorder. This is a person who's working with a very blunt instrument, and you have to reapply ink all the time. You have to read very carefully. I mean, imagine if you were going to take down word for word what I am saying now at rapid conversation speed. You would not be able to do it. I mean, some people were proficient in shorthand and could probably take down fairly quickly what was said. But other people just couldn't. So imagine how much they must have just missed.
Well, in some cases, and I'm not certain this is true, I'm not certain, for example, if it's true for the Joan of Arc trial, but medieval recorder would record just as they did in the ancient world and write rather rapidly on a wax tablet, and with probably all kinds of idiosyncratic abbreviations and shorthand and everything else, and then make a fair copy. And then if it was a literary text, or if it was somebody, you know, dictating a letter or something, then the actual letter writer would read over the fair text and make corrections, and then maybe a final copy would be made. But the first recording would have been, you know, this.
You've already got 2 or 3 hands in there.
You've got it.
Yeah.
And the first recording would have been on a wax tablet probably, which then would get discarded and reused over again.
When did shorthand come about? I didn't realize it was.
Well, the first shorthand manual came about, English shorthand manual in the 1580s.
Wow.
But there were various other systems, sort of Latin systems around.
Sure.
English-based system, 1580s.
It's like this totally 20th century.
No, and in the 17th century, there's a proliferation of manuals because people thought, wow, imagine what we can do with this. And this is why people think that we have a second version of King Lear, and so whether that's actually true, I don't.
I mean, lots of medieval manuscripts are very heavily abbreviated.
Yes.
And I mean, not the fair copy ultimately, although there were enough abbreviations even there, but probably what was written before the fair copy was heavily abbreviated. It wasn't exactly shorthand,
Right.
but you certainly had to, if you were reading it along, you had to know how to expand each abbreviation. Every other word might be abbreviated. And certainly all the Latin case endings and would always have been abbreviated.
Yeah.
So I noticed on the intro page, we just kind of breezed past that this is to be released on GitHub, which for those of you who don't play with computer code much is kind of a forum and a way to communicate with your collaborators when you're working on open source software. So I just went to the GitHub page and it says nothing to see here, move along, which is the default text when there is nothing yet pushed to the repository. So this is obviously an active development. Are there plans to, I mean, one of the benefits of open source development, of course, is to find collaborators early on and to get people involved in the development. And this could go so many directions.
Yeah.
It's as easy as forking a repository, is what they call it, to make a new project out of it. Are there plans to put this up while it's in active development? Could you convince Margo Burns to do so? I'm interested in the project personally.
I don't know. I would have to have that discussion with her.
Sure.
I don't know. I mean, we have not really talked about that as well, but it probably has to be part of the discussion when we move ahead. What is the next step? What do we put in the NEH application?
Yeah, sure. That's the other piece, right?
Yeah,
So-
right.
Yeah, I did. First of all, she's picked a terrific color palette. I really like that. And I like the fact that Checkley's signature is up with the, you know, your logo. That's really beautiful.
I'll relate that to her.
Yeah, very much appreciated. So, like many other questioners, I'm very interested in the decision-making process that goes along with this project. And I can imagine many answers to the following question, but I thought I'd pose it anyway. So, why did you decide to leave creation of a digital edition up to somebody else? And maybe I should frame this besides the fact that it's a lot of work.
Well, there's an easy answer to that one. Cambridge would not allow us to produce an electronic edition.
Really?
Yeah.
For forever or for X years?
So this was part of the contract negotiations, and that was quite early. I mean, it was in 2002. That was very early on, and then they just blankly said no. And we have been in touch with them now to see if they would be interested in doing it, but they have shown very little interest in producing an edition. Even though we have put forward all kinds of reasons why this would be very useful and how it would actually help the sales of the books, because that's what they're thinking about, or that they could have a subscription service or whatever if they wanted to profit from it, but they are adamant about that.
Note to self, do not publish with
Yeah, it's very unfortunate because we actually have the documents, of course, in electronic format, and we can do all kinds of interesting things with those documents. How did it turn out? So that's a little bit of it.
Where are the original documents from?
They're spread out. Most of them are still in Salem. Some of them are the Massachusetts Archives in Boston, some of the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston, some of the Boston Public Library, some of the New York Public Library. Some of them are in private ownership. And we know who those private owners are, but we can't tell. We're sworn to secrecy. And these are very valuable documents. Some of them are worth probably $200,000, $300,000 each. And these are they're little scraps of paper.
Okay, well,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you